Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast, where we talk about issues of God and culture to accelerate our ability to make disciples who do justice and share Jesus to transform New England and our world. We believe that when the people of God do the work of God, it's evangelistic because then people want to know our Jesus. And that's part of why Jesus says, go make disciples, right? People who are willing to disadvantage themselves, to be in unity, to speak truth, to love and serve others, to fix our communities in the world, and get that opportunity to share Jesus. And we've been doing a series of podcasts on the terminology of race. And so we have back with us our, I think one of our, if not our most recurring guest, one of our most recurring guests, who's been so generous with his time and his intellect and his good sense of humor, Dr. Emmett G. Price III. He's the founding pastor at Community of Love Christian Fellowship in Boston. He's a weekly contributor on WGBH Public Radio, and he's the executive producer and co-host of the I think better named podcast, All Revved Up. I think that's a cool name for two pastors doing a podcast. And so, Emmett, thanks for being back with us. I really do appreciate it.
Hey, Charles, thanks for the invitation. It's so wonderful to be back with you and all those who are viewing. And let's get into the conversation, my friend.
Thanks. This is our third episode of this. I lied to Emmett the first time we talked. I said, I'm going to do one episode. And it seems like it's going to turn into a lot more than that because this will be our third. And it's around the language of race or the terminology of race for the reason that it's seeming to me, as I've done reading and research, that language has been evolving. And I don't think everybody agrees it's evolving. So I think we talk past each other sometimes, or it's undefined entirely or just left vague. And we argue with each other about it when we don't even mean the same thing sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's made it confusing. I think some people may like it to be confusing because that helps an agenda, maybe. I think other people are just being honest and trying to figure it all out and piece it together and trying to drive the right kinds of conversations. And so we want to be that latter group, not the former group, but the ones who try and bring clarity to it. And so Emmett's just been great with us helping to work our way through some of that. Today we've talked about just the term racism, structural or systemic racism. I think that might be all we've covered so far. We might have got one more in. Today, we want to talk about a word that we're starting to hear a lot more about, I think, in the conversation too, it's equity. And so I keep going back, if we're trying to get clarity, I keep going back to the dictionary and say, okay, well, words have to have meaning if we're going to be able to communicate with each other. And so the definition, actually, I got this from Georgetown University's Library's Anti-Racism Toolkit. And they define it as a measure of fair treatment, opportunities, and outcomes across race, gender, class, and other dynamics. And Emmett, I've got a couple of definitions I want to run by you. Are you okay with that one?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Is that fair? And so as soon as I read that, I'm like, well, what do we mean by fair, right? And so I went to fair. Webster's defines fair as marked by impact, partiality, and honesty, free from self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism. You go with that? And justice is very similar, freedom from bias or favoritism.
Right.
You good with all of those?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it strikes me then right off before we get into that conversation, Emmett, if you would, put your theologian hat on again and help us with the biblical framework for a concept like equity, and also a biblical framework for the concept of just equality as we might think of it as Americans.
Yeah. So, this is an interesting question because equity is, in essence, a human construct. It's what we as human beings do to or do with one another. Equality, I would say, is a biblical construct in terms of God created humanity and did not give us dominion over each other. Right. So God gave humanity dominion over the flying things, the creepy crawly things, and the swimming things, but never over each other. And a lot of the tension in the Old Testament is people groups leveraging dominion over each other, whether wars, whether whatnot. And we find the tension that Jesus and Paul in the New Testament are trying to say, one another, right? Be gracious to one another, be loving to one another, be kind to one another, etc. So that sense of equality is a biblical construct where equity is us trying to exemplify that prayerfully in the church first, but the church is where we're having huge tensions and challenges with this in terms of how we treat each other. Right. So I, when we look at the work of diversity, equity, and inclusivity, I like to use this analogy as diversity is inviting the voices to the table. Equity is availing to the invitees a space at the table to be, right, to operate at the table. And then inclusivity is to acknowledge that their voices, whether different, whether differential, matter, and they have equal weight to the conversation. And so this equity piece is not just the invitation, but being present and having presence acknowledged and not having dignity removed or having your being not acknowledged.
Okay. And so if I think of the law in the Old Testament, we find things like that seem to suggest a bias that is encouraged towards favoring the poor. Does that fit into equality then, or equity, or something else?
Well, I think it fits in. I mean, so first of all, the fact that you have poor people is an issue with equality, right? Because that means that certain people have resources that perhaps should be shared and distributed that are not being shared and distributed. So God gave humanity dominion over this earth and essentially said, take care of this. And while you're take care of this, take care of one another. And we kind of refuse to take care of one another, right? We partition it, we divide it, we put our stakes in it, and we say, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, which leaves some people without their minds, right? So in that sense, that's the lack of distribution and the lack of access is both an equality issue, which I think is biblical, but also an equity issue, right? Because then it perceives that I'm doing good works or I'm doing charitable works if I avail to somebody else that which is mine, where in actuality, it should be ours in the first place. And,
No, sorry, I don't want to stop. And so is it really meant to be ours in the first place? I certainly get the point of I have to take care of the poor, right? I'm right. I've got a field, right, in the Old Testament, and I'm harvesting that field, right? I can't go back and pick up the pieces that I dropped, and I can't, right? I can't go do within the edges of the property. I can't harvest that. Those are the gleaning laws, right? Where I'm meant to leave that for someone else. So it's my property in a sense. And I'm allowed to have the produce and the offshoot of that, but I'm not allowed unfettered use of my own property. And I have to leave that for someone else. So it seems to me it does allow for it's mine while allowing for an obligation to others. And it sounds like you're saying maybe, no, it's not mine. And so flesh that out for me, please.
Yeah, I mean, so what is perceived as mine is God's, which God avails to me to be a steward of. Now, how I steward that land and that property and those resources should be dictated by my relationship and alignment with God and how God would desire for it to happen. But unfortunately, human beings, as flawed and fallen and broken as we are, tend to be very selfish, self-serving, and self-centered. And in that sense, we need to have, quote unquote, laws to hold us accountable to a higher standard, which we clearly can't do by ourselves. And so whether you look at gleaning laws, which are almost band-aids to fix things that shouldn't be, right? So we shouldn't have to have a law to leave the leftovers or leave the side and the edges for those who are least in, because based on God's sense of equality, I should actually be taking care of them. I should be happy to take care of them. And I shouldn't see them as a they or an other. I should see them as a we and a part of the ecosystem by which I live in.
And so and maybe this just gets into the fallen nature of the world then. So that I certainly understand, although Christians are never selfish. I'm sure you're talking about the world. We Christians never.
Of course not.
Or other Christians, maybe, not you and me. and so there's one part of the equation that is, but I want more wealth myself, right?
Yeah.
I want more financial security for my family. I want to provide for them better. I want to have conspicuous consumption, right? So there's a selfishness aspect that we can be guilty of for sure.
Yeah.
And so my calling is I should be taking care of people who are less fortunate than me before I get into conspicuous consumption. The flip side is some of those people are poor for no fault of their own. Some people are born smarter than others. Some people are more capable than others, right? And that's not something we control as individuals. Or I'm born into a poorer family, right? That gives me less of a head start in life. And so there's a piece of that. Then there's a piece of, well, actually, I make really bad decisions and I don't work hard and I'm foolish and I while the day away and I'm poor as a result of that. And so how do I help that second group? It seems to me that the second group is easier to figure out how to help, although we may not do it, but it's easier to figure out how to help. Maybe I'm so oversimplifying it, but then there's this other group of there's dysfunction there. I can give them all the money in the world and it's not going to end the dysfunction. Is that a fair, is it the wrong framework?
Well, I think, there's some presuppositions here that I think we need to flesh out. I think, I don't think that people who don't have wealth are not cursed, right? So I don't think that poor people are less than. I don't think that people who have a less or who have a perceived lower score on the aptitude test, I don't believe that they're cursed either. Mm-hmm. And I think so part of our human instinct and the frame of reference that we use is that smarter people should be weller off, and those people who are weller off financially should actually be the smarter people. I mean, I think that's a presupposition that is not biblical, first of all.
Well, can I just reword it then? Because I wasn't saying that they should be. I was saying that in our society, for capable people, and capabilities I'll define broadly, which is not just intellect and hard work, but network and all these other kinds of things, and that they are able to exploit, tend to do better in our context. Right. I'm not suggesting whether they should or not, and whether that's biblical or not, but I think that's a reality. Are you saying you don't agree with that?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you define better. I mean, if your social measurement is based on a bank account and based on title and based on, accumulated wealth, then I guess so. But when you think about,
I'm an American. How else would I define it? Right?
Well, I mean, but I think that's the point. You're a white American. You see what I mean? I guess that's the point. And you've had generational access to both network and net worth. Mm-hmm. And for people who are, I mean, let's take our indigenous brothers and sisters who were here first, mm-hmm. Even before you and your ancestry got here. By right, they should have had the advantages of the land, of ownership, of the ability to generate generational wealth. And we see how that's operated. And there has not been a sense of fairness. There's not been a sense of justice. And yet we snub that and say that those of us, whomever, who have been able to benefit, we have worked hard. We've deserved everything that we've earned. And we should be proud of this because it's a reflection of our work ethic and our whatever. And I'm saying those presuppositions don't necessarily hold up. Right. And they're certainly not biblical.
Yeah, I think there's at least a tension, because I think it's hard to deny that hard work and smarts matter, right? Financially, at least. And I think, and maybe I am talking more economically than we should, because it assumes doing well economically is doing well. But also your start in life matters, right? I've said before there's tons of data that shows if you grow up in a two-parent household, you've got a big edge. If you get an education, you've got a big edge. And I didn't pick any of those things, right? I didn't pick my family. I didn't pick how much money they had. My family was not a rich family, but we weren't a poor family either. And so those things combined, I think, work together to influence significantly how well you do financially in this country. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely do influence significantly. And I think there's the other measurements that, you know, the greatest majority of people on governmental assistance are not Black and brown, they're white. The greatest beneficiaries for affirmative action have not been Black and brown, they've been white women, right? So even this sense of whiteness still permeates the spaces where the helps are, which continues to disenfranchise and decenter the rest of the people, right? So the real question is, in this nation, what does it mean to be white? And the secondary question that my dear friend and colleague Reverend Irene Monroe asks is, can you be white without being supremacist? And the reason I ask this question is because if the measurement of success and acquisition of wealth and net worth and all those things are associated with access and opportunity, which are controlled by a certain population of people who become the gatekeepers in terms of who have access and who doesn't, then how do we operate from a sense of equity, which is your question, and not from a sense of supremacy? Right? Because the decision makers get to decide who gets what and who gets when, right? And if they're continuing to choose people who look like them, even for the distribution of helps and assistance, then it further creates a systemic disenfranchisement for other people who we continue to otherize.
When you say the decision makers, whom do you mean?
The people who have the acquired wealth, who get to decide how they distribute that wealth.
So wealthy people.
Correct. Or people who control the you know, whatever the financial mechanisms for, you know, distribution. Let me give you a perfect example. You know, during COVID, we had the CARE Act, right? Congressional Act, which availed resources for folks to keep their payroll, you know, the PPP, right? To this day, I'm still baffled. Why was it that corporate entities, huge entities, were taking advantage of resources that were actually specifically put in place for small businesses, for businesses of color in certain neighborhoods? And so the people who actually needed it the most didn't have access to it for a host of reasons. The people who perhaps didn't need it as much were the first in line, had access, and benefited from it.
Well, so I think that's a good example, because what I've pointed out a couple of times, what I've seen is that some churches applied for PPP money. Mm-hmm. Right? Maybe for folks who are listening, right? Under the CARES Act, passed in the midst of COVID to try and help businesses to not go broke. They approved a program where you could get, I think it was like 2.5 times your expenses or something. I forget the actual formula. There's a formula that said, based on what your expenses are, you have access to the amount of money, and it could be turned from a loan into a grant under certain conditions, mm-hmm. Based on how you use that money. And we did see some churches applying for PPP grants. And what I saw was that more white churches were structured in a way to take advantage of that, because they would have a separate and distinct entity that was its own unique, a corporation, for example, a nonprofit corporation. They also might have bankers in their network of their church. So, for example, one church, it got stuck. Nobody could get an answer, but they knew somebody who worked at the bank in this role, and they finally, and suddenly it got moving again. And what I found, what I experienced in majority African American churches is that there is not necessarily a separate organization. They don't necessarily have a separate set of books, and they the pastor's finances and the church finances are just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so now when it came time to apply, they had a call it a structural disadvantage because that's not how they're organized. And they didn't necessarily have that same network of, there's a banker, a senior guy at the bank working in my congregation that I can reach out to. So it seemed to me that it played out in a way that they were treated equally under the law, but the outcome of it was not equitable. If we think about it from a Christian perspective, right? It was not equitable. Someone was disadvantaged in this. Is that, I think of that when I talk about an equity issue, I think about that. I'm not sure what the solution is to that, but I think of that. Am I on the right track when we talk about
I think the access and the opportunity become interesting wedges, right? So, you have one model, which is what we experience on the planes, right? They say if in the case of emergency, put your mask on first, and then put the mask on the child or whomever you're with, right? That's one model. I have a problem with that because at the end of the day, and I get the concept behind it, but I want to make sure that kid is okay. I don't want to wait till I get my mask on to make sure it's operating in the right. So for me, there's a sense of how do we do this together? Right? Rather than let my white church get its PPP. Once we get everything stabilized and focused, then we'll come over and we'll help you out a little bit. Right? How come we can't go to the bank together? How come that member of your church, who's the vice president of the bank, can't write 2 checks to your church and our church? Why is there a competition for resources? Right? And that's the challenge.
Yeah, I don't know that there was, though. In the scenarios I'm thinking of, it was more of, I didn't get one because I didn't have somebody I couldn't make my books work that way. Right. And so I needed an entity by which I was applying, and I don't have an entity, and you're not going to get an entity overnight for something like that and then prove an expense base. And so it was like, by the time they passed the law, some of our African-American pastors were like, I couldn't do that. So I wasn't competing for the resource even. I just can't even apply the way I'm being expected to apply because of how I've been organized historically. And I know, because I saw so much cooperation between churches, that had that pastor said, hey, Charles, I need somebody who can, now I might not know somebody at that bank, but I'd be putting the feelers out, and the guy they knew at the white church who could get somebody to help them with theirs might not be the same bank that they're applying to. But people were absolutely willing to help each other. So it wasn't we were competing to get my money, then I'll worry about your money. It was partly we work in different networks, right? That's a division in the church that shouldn't be, but we do line up according to race. We're working a lot to try and solve for that. But it was more of, I can't apply that way. I don't have an entity that I can apply that way. And so, and if I do, now you run into the things of, I may not have a network that helps me. And right by the time and another issue, African-American churches are not as banked, if you will, as some of the white churches are. So they don't have a cash balance there that they're known to their banker. They're not necessarily dealing in a big regional bank or national bank where they're known to them, right? So now, and the bigger banks were the ones who moved the money the fastest. So you had a number of things that seemed to have played into it that was not, I don't think anybody intentionally discriminated. I just think they did a bad job on it, right? They just threw money out the door as fast as they could, right? And there wasn't tons of thought about how to do it. And I think we realized this issue as it was playing out, and it was too late to fix the legislation at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think you laid it out perfectly. That there's resources that are available. The people perhaps who need them the most don't have access to them and don't have the opportunity to benefit from them. That's a systemic challenge, right? Yeah. I mean, and for that to happen within the church is actually embarrassing, right? Because it almost suggests that only the churches with corporate models or corporate structures are the real churches who are worthy of being resourced so they can continue ministry, right? And that gets to a high tier, low tier, gets back to, who has, those type of resources. And I think that that's a huge challenge. Yeah. And that's, it's not equitable. and it doesn't show equity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I agree with you. It's a hard problem because I'm not sure how to solve for it, right? In the midst of a crisis, if we were to do it again, how would we write this law differently? And I'm not sure what the right solution is, because we're not going to give PPP loans to everybody who comes along. And so it was about a business thing, and the government decided to see churches as businesses in that.
Yeah.
Now the beauty of it, I will say, the beauty of it though, was we did see churches working the way you're talking about, right? We worked with David Wright at the Black Ministerial Alliance 10 Point in Boston, and we raised $60,000, and another church gave another 60, not through us, so $120,000 purely to support BMA churches, Black Ministerial Alliance 10 Point churches in the Boston area. And we had churches giving directly. So I think there was a church acting like the church, at least in some of our context.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the government didn't create a structure, and I don't know that they could figure out how to do it, even if they were to take a second swing at it.
Yeah, I mean, and the PPP loans were not necessarily for religious entities in the first place. So
that became an interpretive thing, right?
Yeah, and so you're right. I guess my point is that going back to kind of the Levitical order and Deuteronomy in terms of these gleaning laws and whatnot, that we are still as a church creating band-aids rather than doing the right thing from the very beginning. You see what I mean? So, and I think that's the aspiration for us to not see each other as the white church and the black church and the Korean church and this church and whatnot, but to truly be the Church of Jesus Christ, in this region, or, in the city of Boston, or wherever. So that the relationships and the proximity and the intimacy that we build would actually guide, these moments of trauma and chaos and calamity.
Yeah, and that's exactly where our focus is building those relationships. But it's not a pastor friend of ours on one of our calls. We were trying to figure out how to do some of this stuff. Said, hey, we should start out from the assumption we're going to fail, because people have tried all this before and failed. And he said, so now maybe the time is right. Maybe this is a different time. Maybe maybe enough has happened that we can actually do this kind of stuff and have real unity. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking it will be fast or easy.
Yeah. Because every failure puts us back, right? So every time we do fail, and every time there's a trauma that is that we don't lament it together, every time there's a tragedy that we don't speak up about, these things create resentment, and they create, an additional layer of tough, rough skin that hinders us from getting to the heart of the situation. So, I mean, and we have to build relationships not for strategic purposes, but for the sake of relationships, so that when we need to develop strategic operatives, the relationships are already there. Yeah,
that's right. I have a relationship with my brother because he's my brother, not because I need something.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And so we've been there. I don't know if you've been seeing this case, but there's been some legal cases. So the Biden administration, right, there was a third COVID bill, I guess, by this point, which was a $2 trillion one passed maybe in March, I think it was. And their approach on some farm aid was that they were going to give it, that there was a 60-day window where only Black farmers could apply for funds. And their argument was that was for equity reasons. So we want to make sure that the Black farmers are not disadvantaged in this. And there's a court case around that, because then white farmers said, you're treating me different based on the color of my skin, which you can't argue, right? And a judge put an injunction on it. But is that an equitable way to solve the problem? Forget about whether it's constitutional or not, but is that an equitable way, or is that not a helpful way?
No, I think it's an approach. It's an approach to a need that is felt by a certain community that feels ostracized, disenfranchised, and left out. The problem is that once they get invited to the table, they're no longer welcomed. Once they're invited to the table, they're actually no longer welcomed. Right. So if you're trying to create a resolution to a historical challenge, and you say for this particular situation, we want to give a 60-day window or a 90-day window threshold for this population of people who have historically been disenfranchised. I mean, that's proven.
Well,
for the people who now feel like they're taking our money, I mean, what do you say?
I think I struggle with a couple of places, because I think when we say, hey, have African Americans been historically disadvantaged? The answer is yes. If we say, did that specific farmer, were they disadvantaged, and are they more disadvantaged than I am today as a farmer? I said, then that answer might be maybe or maybe not. And the sole criteria is what color is their skin, which seems to me only that so we may be inequitable and unjust in how we administer that money, because you can be a rich black farmer and I can be a poor white farmer. But we also are going to create more divisions, because now I don't like you anymore, right? I'm angry at you and people of other black people because I'm being disadvantaged because of something that I didn't do. Now, not everybody will agree whether I did something or not, but I didn't do, and now I'm paying a price for it. And that's only destructive.
Here's the friction. Here's the friction. One, the assumption that black farm, and you didn't make this assumption, I'm making the assumption that black farmers who are doing well would get in line to take the money. And that two, that that by taking that money, it creates an advantage over white farmers who, again, the perception is have had access to those resources for generations. Like I lose that, right? Because at the end of the day, if we decide that we want to be an equitable nation, then there has to be a redisbursement of power, of access and opportunity. And if we're not willing to redisperse that power, access, and opportunity, then we really don't want to be an equitable nation. And I think that comes to the core of what we as believers believe, right? Because you can't believe in, well, I guess you can, in a God who created all humanity and desires to have proximity and intimacy with all humanity. And then we at the human level get to decide who gets to be closer to God and who gets to have access to God via this mechanism that Jesus Christ invited us into called the church, right? So we're taking a divine construct and we're humanizing in it a way where we actually begin to play God versus taking the heart of what God desires and has revealed to us time and time again. Right. So if I am going to be upset with a person of another race because now they get what I think is mine, we've lost the whole divine principle of equality.
Well, some would say, well, yes, because we started treating somebody different based on the color of their skin.
But the whole premise of how we got to the disparity is because those who had decided that those who, based on the color of their skin, would not have. So the only way to reverse that is to give the people who have the color in their skin, who have been disparaged and not have access for generations. Now we give them access, right? So it goes back to supremacy. If I'm used to being the one in charge, if I'm used to being the one in power, if I'm used to being the one with resources, and if I'm used to being the one who's distributing those things, and now I see those things that I'm used to having being given to somebody else, what I'm bothered by is the fact that I'm losing power, I'm losing privilege, I'm losing access, and I'm losing opportunity to maintain what I'm used to. Right. And if we're going to have equality and equity, there has to be a redistribution.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I agree that's always the case of what's operational here. I can certainly see that would play in some places. I think that what we see more often today is there are people who do have the power. I'd say it's more than wealth. I would say elite.
Sure.
Because I think we've got to lead in academia, we've got to lead in the media, we've got to lead in business. And I think it seems to me there's great commonality about how they think about things. And it seems more and more the solution is for them not to disadvantage themselves. And I'm making broad generalizations, I know, but disadvantage themselves to help other people. It's I want to disadvantage you to help you. And that seems to me how equity is playing out in some of these conversations. And it goes to where I don't think government can be equitable. I think the best we can hope for, and we haven't always had a great track record at it, the best we can hope for is government to treat people equally. And then I think it's left to us as the church to be the ones who create equity. Would you disagree with that?
Yeah, I think I'm a divine optimist. So,
I might say.
So, what you just laid out was actually beautiful. I think the church should actually take the responsibility for leading society, and and the government has a different role for accountability and creating structures and infrastructure and whatnot. So, in that sense, I would agree with what you're saying, but I'm also a pragmatist. And I just don't think that we as human beings, whether we're in the church or outside of the church, we just don't have enough wisdom and we don't have enough courage to do the unthinkable humanly, right? So Jesus says, if you tell this mountain to move into the sea, then it will do it, right, by faith. I just don't think we have that level of faith, one, in God, but two, in each other, where we don't doubt, right? And so I think the challenge for the church is, can the church, rather than focusing so much on going to the nations and doing this and that, can the church actually get in the mirror and get itself right and get itself together, right? Which means that at the cellular level, that each of us need to get in the mirror and say, rather than focusing on what we are called to do or what we need to do or what strategically would bring glory to God, can we actually get in the mirror and say that I just want my life to glorify God and function at that level? Because I think if we do a little bit more of that, then I think we'll have a shift in our thinking in terms of what privilege looks like and what equity looks like and what equality looks like and what inclusivity looks like. But while we're still positioning ourselves to retain and to guard and to protect that which I've accumulated. And of course, we blame God for everything, right? That which God has blessed me with, right? Then I think our posture is a little off.
But I think, when you say that, what you're reminding me of, and I can't remember who said this, is, of course, what disciples, and we talk about this even in our introduction, right? Disciples are people who disadvantage themselves for others. So as believers, when I'm disadvantaged in one of those programs, it does seem like my response should be, that's okay, because someone else is benefiting. I think that's very unusual.
Yeah, it is.
For us to be able to say that, because we're human and we're selfish, and we do have I've still got to take care of my family. It's not selfish. My family has to eat just like anybody else's family has to eat. And so there's an aspect of believers should be better with being disadvantaged in an equation like that. And I'm not sure we always are. But our attitude should be, let's put you in the position of you're not a believer, right? But I should be okay then being disadvantaged to help you, because as this person said, it's the best Emmett's ever going to have it. Here on earth is the best he's ever going to have it. And so make it as good for him as you can, because you're going to have it way better one day. And I don't know that that's always our thought process.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about the way that you say it is I reflect on the Black experience in the United States of America. And this is not regional. This happens in New England. This happens in the South. It happens in the West, in the mid nation, that within Black communities, we have not had the legacy of worrying about my family to the demise of the family next door. It just hasn't been a communal tradition. So even hearing you say that right now, it's interesting to me, because culturally I don't know that experience. So culturally, in a black neighborhood or in a black community or in a black church, if I know that my neighbor does not have food to eat, then we will make a meal and take that meal to my neighbor, even if it means that me and my children have half of what we would have eaten. That so that level of community and that tradition, it doesn't speak to an individualistic ideology. It actually speaks to a communal ideology, which is perhaps why many black churches don't have the corporate structure, and which is why many black churches have a differential system of record keeping and bookkeeping, right? Because we're so focused on the community and providing access to those who don't have, based on what little perhaps we may have or what lot we may have. And so again, the differential thought process, and I'm not saying one is more godly and one is less godly. I'm not going there. But what I'm saying is that there is a different mindset that operates here.
Well, you're making me think. And so my family came over early 20th century, and I think they probably would describe something very similar in terms of that community, because you were in the German part of town, or you were in the Polish part of town, and we all and you came over and had nothing, so we took you in for 3 months till you could get on your feet, and right. And it seems to me that those stories are with me. That at some point wealth changes our. I don't know if it is wealth, but so I may be prematurely judging. Wealth changes our view on that, and that poorer people are better at sharing in their lack than sometimes we richer people are. And again, broad brush, but we richer people are in sharing out of our wealth.
But here's what's interesting. When you're poor, you're not worried about what the rich people are doing. And actually, when you're poor, you don't see yourself as poor. Poor is a narrative that is subscribed by people who are not poor.
Okay.
Right. So when you're poor, you operate from a position of actually being very rich in community, being rich in gratitude, being rich in so many different things that by social measurement are not that they're not accounted for. And that goes back to the beginning of our conversation in terms of this dynamic of, intelligence and wealth, being kind of social measurements. Some of the less wealthy people are some of the most giving people you have ever met, right? And so it's not that they're giving because they have so many resources. They're giving because they know what it is not to have. And that makes them rich in humility. It makes them rich in some of the things that I think God values, right? And I think that that's a tension in terms of who's defining who, and what does that mean in terms of how people see themselves and how we see them.
You just hit on something that, I'm an American. I love America. I think America's got great blessings. I'm thankful God put me here, all those kinds of things. But I think there is something broken in us in America, just like any other country. But one of the things that are broken is exactly what you're talking about. How many people I've heard go on mission trips to poorer countries, financially poorer countries, and come back and are stunned that in the poverty, people are happy. Because we have trouble processing that, even as believers, that you can be happy and poor.
Yeah, I mean, it's counterintuitive to me, because it's like the poor people who Jesus focused on. Like, again, it's counterintuitive to me, because to be closer to Jesus means that you're willing to give it all up, right? To be a disciple means that you would be willing to leave everything in order to take this journey. And so what you have just articulated as what again, I'm hearing you say as an American thing. I refute that, because I'm also from this nation and I feel differently than you. And that may be access points and social location or whatnot. But the point that I'm making is that it strikes me as, here's the point that I make. Rather than reading about each other, we need to spend more time doing this, Charles, because I think with proximity and intimacy, I can learn much more about how you think, how you experience, life, and and what is meaningful to you, so that we can find synergies and similarities for which we can build our relationship. But if I'm simply reading about you and reading about your scenario, I don't have this proximity to be able to question and be able to really get into the weeds of certain things. And the problem is we intellectualize everything to the point that many people who are not Black will read a couple of books and then they assume that they know the Black experience as if it's a monolith and homogenous. And the point that I think we're tensioning here is that we can both be from the same country and feel two very different ways about not just our social location within the country, but the access points and the opportunities within this country. And those two different points are both right.
And you know, and we were talking about this. I think, you know, we do a podcast once a month with Dr. Hammond and Pastor Enoch Lau, and we talk about politics. And we come at it from very different perspectives. And what we found over this time, we picked some pretty polarizing issues. And on paper, we're not supposed to agree with each other, right? Dr. Hammond is an African-American pastor. I'm a white guy from the suburbs. Pastor Enoch is a Chinese-American pastor from Boston. We're not supposed to agree with each other, let alone like each other, right? But when you sit down and talk, it's like, you know, you go through this stuff and there's not so much disagreement when we actually sit down and get to know each other. We don't agree on everything.
Right.
But we got, and Ray was the one who pointed this out so often to us, we're just stuck in our silos. Right? We don't know we agree on so many things because the media narrative is you're a Black American, so you think these things. I'm a white American, I think these things. And you know, I was just reading last night in the Wall Street Journal had a piece on the election in New York City, right? And so you have all of you know, this whole thing is we have the history of violence with the police, and specifically George Floyd, and that's turned into a defund the police movement. And of course, the way the media wants us to hear it, I think, is all Black Americans think we should defund the police. I don't know any Black Americans who think that, but that's not saying none do. But who did, you know, they just elected in New York a mayor, well, Democratic candidate for mayor, likely to be the mayor, right? Who's a Black American who ran on, we need to actually fight crime in the city because it's gotten so out of hand. And he drew most of his support from urban, ethnic, poorer communities who suffer from the crime. And his opponents got, you know, support from Tony White areas. And so we don't fit our stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are more intelligent than we operate. And I don't mean that based on the aptitude test. I base this on this, and I work for the media, so I'm not going to blame the media for being corporate, right? I'm going to say that I have enough sense, enough wisdom to discern what nuggets of information are valid and valuable, and then to leave the rest behind, so that I don't ever want to be a zombie of the media, blaming the media for what I think, what I feel, and what I know. And so I think we need to get away from that. And clearly the media in the 21st century is not like it was back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where, you know, you had, you know, a very objective, you know, not much opining. So clearly we are reminiscing to a previous day. But also with this age of information, where we have so much information at access in our hands and our fingertips, it's forcing us to really discern. And I think we spend more time, you know, trolling information than on our knees before God. And I think that is deeply negatively impacting the church, because the church has found itself in many ways, in the different fragments of the church, picking sides, standing on platforms and having specific agendas. And I think there's only really one agenda that we can have, which is God's agenda, which we need to tap in and tune into God and not these media stations in order to receive our commission to know exactly how and what and when to do. So in that sense, we have a whole lot of internal work that we have to do.
Yeah, every once in a while, people don't always use these words, but every once in a while you see it where both sides, God is on our side on this. right? God wants our policy on this. And I can't remember who, I always forget who said things. I just remember what they said. And I'm like, no. It's not whether God's on your side. It's, are you on God's side?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we get caught in that trap, it seems a lot, of no. My view is this, and God supports my view.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we always have that right.
I think the moment that we move into an eisegetical system, where God is picking our favorite football team and our favorite basketball team, I think we're in a whole lot of trouble.
Because there might be other believers who support the guys they're playing, right? and so I'm hearing at least two things you're saying the church can do to engage, to kind of work through this equity issue. One is we need relationship across ethnicities.
Yeah.
The other is prayer. Is there other words you would say, hey, church, is it support these policies? Is it, what else would you say?
Well, I think, policies are for human beings. I think those are individual decisions by which we, in terms of our own local politics. I think the church has a responsibility to see itself as a communal organization and entity, which means that things have to be decided for the greater good, for the common good. And if we can't figure out what the common good is, and not just the common good for your people or the common good for my people, but for the common good of humanity, the church, again, is supposed to lead society. It's supposed to be the moral and the virtuous entity which dictates and demands for human beings to be who God has called us to be and to be greater tomorrow than we were yesterday based on the decisions we make today. And those decisions should be made on the benefit of humanity and not just me, my, and I. So I think the church has to be introspective and reflective and to remember as we take the Lord's Supper, whenever we take the Lord's Supper, whether it's on the first Sunday, whatever, that we do this in remembrance of Christ. We need to remember what Christ endeavored to do with those disciples. We need to remember the legacy of Christ's ministry and the mission. And we need to remember that Christ loved everybody. Christ did not rob anybody of their dignity. And even when he got pissed in a dignified and divine way. And I think that those are things that the church has to do. And we as leaders within the church have to hold ourselves to a higher standard, to be willing to have courageous conversations, to be willing to engage in difficult, moments, and to not pull the carpet from under each other or to remove the table so that the conversation will no longer go on. And I think that those are some of the things that the church has a responsibility to do, rather than looking for government to do that, and rather than looking for another martyr to do that. We, the church, we, the people, the body of Christ, have a responsibility to come together and do that work.
Yeah, and it really does boil down to disadvantaging ourselves, I think, because it's, we're so caught up in our own wants and needs. And we think that those are things God wants for us, right? Because how could he not, right? I've determined in my infinite wisdom, he must agree with me, right? And I don't think we're always, I call it disadvantaging other people's sacrifice, right? That Jesus called it, right? But I think for some people, it's helpful to hear that disadvantaging ourselves, especially people outside the church. But I don't think we're always good at it, I think the church does amazing things disadvantaging ourselves. So I don't want to be too oversimplistic, right? The church feeds poor people. It houses people who are homeless. It provides for unwed mothers. It provides for survivors of human trafficking. I'm not sure we are always willing to, when the disadvantage cuts too close, it feels to me, a lot of times we miss on that. And again, I'm talking broader brush. There are certainly people who would be exceptions and sacrificed very deeply to care for other people. But it seems that as Americans, we kind of often, at least in my church tradition, the notion that I'm going to give up my mortgage payment so you can have yours is not something we do. And maybe the question is, and should we? Because the Bible does talk about, hey, take care of your family, right? A fool doesn't take care of his family. Help me out.
Yeah, I mean, the book of Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, which, for those of us who are church planters, I mean, this is like one of the models, right? Where the people disadvantaged themselves in the way that you're saying they sold all their possessions so that those who didn't have had, right? I mean, that goes totally against capitalism. It goes totally against this kind of notion of consumeristic, privilege where we're hoarding things. And so I think the church, particularly of Jesus Christ, United States of America, has to make a decision as to whether are we going to be able to redistribute things the way that the book of Acts does. And the other thing is this: we're cool in feeding the poor, and I'm just using that to reference what you said, while they're poor. We're not cool when the poor people become rich as a result of us feeding them, because now we get jealous. So the challenge is, are we doing these things for the right reasons? Or are we doing them because they make us feel good about disadvantaging ourselves to those who are perceived as disadvantaged, right? And for me, the analogy is what Jesus said: when you fast, don't go walking around with your cheeks all sucked in and, your belly all, as if you're hungry and you're starving. Or, when you do a good work, don't go bragging to everybody that I just gave, X amount of thousands of dollars with it, right? He says, do it, right, in secret. And I'm not sure it's so much about the secrecy of it, but don't boast about what you should be doing anyway.
Yeah, because I think there is the concept of don't put your light under a bushel basket too.
Yeah.
And I think the church, because we're afraid of seeming proud, we miss the opportunity to tell people the amazing things the church actually does that the world cares about. And Matthew 5:16 talks about it. When people see the good words of God, the good works of God's people, right, they praise God because of it. So it's evangelistic, but it's not when we're boastful about it. So I agree with you.
Yeah, and they should see it. They shouldn't see the church despising a certain population of people. They shouldn't see the church humiliating. They shouldn't see the church treating people even within the church bad and in dismay and all that kind of stuff, because that soils our witness, man.
Now, I'm going to disagree with you on one point, because I would come at it from Acts 2 and 4 and say it's got nothing to do with capitalism or not. So I don't think it is anti-capitalism, because they got those possessions some way. It's about, you can exist in a free market capitalist society and you can work for the wealth. But the point you're making is, but then you give it away. That doesn't undo the process or the economic system by which you get it. It does talk about hoarding it, which capitalism doesn't say you should hoard wealth. It just recognizes people are selfish and look for gain and will try and do it. But as believers, we ought to be able to exist in that thing and still give our stuff away to help other people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not anti-capitalistic. I mean, and I'm certainly no economist, so I'm gonna leave you with that word. But but I will say this: that believers should be able to function in any economic system and in any governmental system, because who we take our orders from and who we're commissioned by and consecrated by is much bigger than these human entities, whether it's a economic system or a political system. So yeah, we should be able to function in all of these systems. So yeah, I'm not anti-capitalistic at all. I mean, I agree with what you said. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, let me give you the last word. I see we're almost at 11 o'clock. What final thoughts on this?
Man, we're at 11 o'clock already.
I know.
Well, a final thought is this, Charles. And let me begin it with this a sincere expression of gratitude, because you didn't have to invite me back. And I'm just so grateful for, our burgeoning friendship, and the way that we're able to even burgeon it publicly in these conversations, which are not scripted. I had no idea which way you were going. You had no idea which way I was going, but we're committed to staying at the table, and we're committed to engaging in fruitful conversation with a fulcrum, right, where God is center.
Yeah.
And we can disagree on how we see things, how we experience things, how we intellectualize things, but we agree that God is at the center. And with that agreement, we can have these conversations, and they can go as far whatever direction they need to go. But that does not avail to me an opportunity to lose respect for you, to rob you of your dignity, or to think anything other than I really enjoy spending time with this brother, and I can't wait for the next time. So thank you.
Amen. Well, thank you for being so gracious, not just with your time as you always are, but those gracious words. I appreciate it and know it's reciprocal. I enjoy our conversations. I think they're challenging for me as I'm trying to work through some of this stuff. And so I appreciate you being patient and sharing your wisdom. And I think those are wise words to end on, God being the center of it. So thank you very much for being back with us. And I look forward to the next time too.
Amen.
And so thank you to our audience as well. I hope this blessed you. I hope some of what you heard from Dr. Price is something that you chew on, right? I think there's some of these topics we really just need to wallow in as believers and really question and pray, what of this is what I'm personally convicted by? And what am I personally supposed to do differently? And those things, God, I have a friend who says, if you pray for smarts, God doesn't make you stupid. Right? And so I think I think the same thing is true here. If we pray for what we are supposed to be doing to bring reconciliation to God's people and the world, God will answer that prayer. He'll honor that. And so I pray something in here helped you along that journey. And I'd like to thank our new producer, Ashley Pitkin, for putting this all together for us. Our next podcast, we're going to have Pastor Kika Gobrel, who's the youth and young adult pastor at Arab Evangelical Baptist Church and pastor of their English speaking service. And he'll be talking about what he's calling the online revival, people who are using social media for evangelism. It was fascinating for me to hear about. And so we're going to give Kika the opportunity to share it with all of you. So thanks very much for being with us. God bless you.